I have been a pet portrait artist for around about 4 years now, and although sometimes doing commissions can be challenging, doing pet portraits has also been extremely rewarding. My name is Rachel, I'm a pet portrait and wildlife artist, and today I wanted to share some tips with you on how to paint teeny tiny pet portraits. I've been painting a series of miniature wildlife so far this year, and I thought it was about time my pet portraits received the same miniature treatment. So I've been working on a few portraits that are 2 by 2 inches, and I thought while we have a look at some of those, I would share some of the steps I take when I do these pet portraits and some tips that might help you if you are also interested in creating tiny pet portraits. There will also be some information in here that will be relevant to pet portraits on a different scale as well. So if 2 by 2 inches is a little bit too tiny, then there still might be some information in here that will hopefully be useful. But that's enough waffling for now, so let's get into it. So the first thing that I do before starting any painting is consider the reference photo. A reference photo can really make or break a painting, so it is worthwhile spending a bit of time choosing the right one to work from. It can be the difference between a lovely painting process and a really terrible one where you feel like you're fighting the painting the entire time. Now, when you're working on a commission, sometimes you will be a little bit limited as to the photos that you have to use, so there might be some compromise, especially if it's a memorial painting or there just aren't that many pictures of this particular pet. So there is that to bear in mind, but it is good to get into the habit, if you can, of asking clients for multiple photos where you can then choose the one that you prefer out of that whole selection. We could potentially do like a whole video just on what makes a good pet portrait reference photo, but trying to keep it simple just for now. Some of the things that I look for that make a good reference are good lighting. So I like there to be some light and shadow and it not to be too flat. I like there to be enough detail to work from, so not blurry or out of focus. The color should be accurate. You would like the photo to be taken from a good angle, usually eye level with the pet or somewhere around there so you can see the expression, a good pose from the pet. All of those things can help to create a good painting because you're already off to a good start if you've got a decent reference photo to work from. You might be able to compromise on some of those things, and the more practice you get, the more you'll start to realize what you specifically need from a reference photo for you to be able to do the kind of painting you want to do. Once the reference photo is sorted, then the next thing to do is just get on with the portrait, and I usually start with a sketch. I like to use the grid method for my sketches so that I can get everything in the right place. When I'm working on a scale as small as this, then usually I will use centimetre grid squares, but I would use 1-inch grid squares if I were doing something larger. This is 5 by 5 centimetres, which is roughly 2 by 2 inches. It's not precise, but it's good enough for what I need it for at the moment. I usually use Canva to put a grid on top of my reference photo, and then I'll use that to do the drawing. It helps me get everything in the right place before I get started, and so I can just concentrate on the painting. I don't need to worry about correcting the drawing as I go along. It saves time when I'm working on commissions, making sure that everything is in the right place before I get started. So this is my preference, but you might decide to do it a different way. There are lots of different ways of painting, and the things I'll be sharing in this video are just what happened to it for me at the moment. Once I have done my sketch, it's time to move on to the painting, and usually I'll start with the background. For these paintings, I've been working on oil painting paper, and usually I will put some washi tape around the edge just to make a nice neat border to the painting. It is worth testing out tape like this on your oil painting paper to see if it comes away from the paper easily or if it is likely to rip or tear, because you don't want to ruin your painting by removing the tape afterwards. And so that is just something that I have learned over time to be careful with. When I first started doing pet portraits, I would usually do the portrait first and then the background would be a bit of an afterthought. I do it the other way around now because my opinion on backgrounds has changed quite a lot. I feel like they're much more of an integral part of the painting now because they provide the setting for your animal to sit in. The colour, the level of detail of the background is going to have a big impact on what the overall painting looks like. So I like to have a good idea of what the pet is going to be sitting against. And so when I do paint the portrait, then I am painting it with the background in mind like the whole time. I like for these portraits to look like they are fairly realistic, so I want the pet to look as if it's sitting in that particular background, so I want the lighting and the values to match and the colours to be tied together. Also, another reason for doing the background first is that it can help you to get more realistic fur details. If I put in the background and then I start painting the pet, when it comes to like long wispy bits of fur, I can use my paintbrush to drag the fur out into the background and it creates a nice realistic effect. It's a little bit more challenging trying to do that the other way around. If I try and paint the background up towards the pet, what often happens is it looks like the animal is then superimposed onto that background and it doesn't really look like it's part of the scene. One other tip that I have when it comes to painting backgrounds is that you don't need to include all of the detail that you can see in your reference photo. So for example, in the reference for this painting, the dog is sitting against a bin. There's a jacket in the background, there's some shoes. I don't need to paint all of those things for this to make a good painting. The painting is not going to be better just because I decide to put in a really detailed dustbin. But I do want it to look like it's still sitting within that space, so I don't want to change the background too drastically. So what I do in those instances is I take my cues from the reference photo, but I don't paint everything in detail. I know in this example that there needs to be a darker area on the left so that the highlights show up on the dog's face. Instead of painting the whole bin, I'm just going to paint that a nice dark colour. If I look closely at the bin, there are some blues and greens in there, which kind of inspired the colour that I ended up using. I didn't want to put a grey colour. You can use some artistic license here. The main thing really was that that side of the painting was darker. I then made the other side of the painting lighter because that's what is reflected in the reference photo. So you're kind of using it as inspiration, but you don't have to do everything in minute detail for it to look right. So moving on to the portrait itself, I like to do these paintings section by section, rather than working on the whole piece altogether. There are some disadvantages of this, such as you can sometimes get so wrapped up in the section that you're working on that you forget to check how it looks against the rest of the painting. I don't find that that's as much of a problem when I'm working on a small scale, but it is something to be aware of if you decide to do something similar. Usually I will look for a particular feature in the portrait that kind of acts as like a natural cutoff point, and that will guide me as to where I end each section. Within the sections, I work following similar guidelines to how you would paint if you were doing it all in one go. So I work from dark areas to light, and usually I work from larger shapes to smaller shapes, just obviously on a much smaller scale within each individual section. So I'll often start out with one of the darker tones in that particular section and then gradually work my way to the lighter areas. I'm also being careful not to add too much detail. When you're working on a tiny scale like this, you don't need to include every single feature that you can see in your reference photo. So for example, you can see individual hairs in the reference photo in this particular section. And if I were working on a large scale, going for hyperrealism, maybe working coloured pencils, I potentially would be putting in all of that detail. At this scale with oil paints for these purposes, I don't need to do that. Instead, I am going to look at the general colours of the area and the values, so how light or dark it is. And those are the really important features that I want to put in this painting. Understanding how much detail you need to include is something that I think comes with time. I've done a lot of paintings in the past that have not gone quite so well, where I've over detailed them or maybe not put in enough information. But over time, you'll start to learn how much you actually need to put into a painting in order for it to make sense. And that's kind of the level that we're going for. No more than that. We want to describe what it looks like, make it look realistic, but we don't want to be adding unnecessary detail that's just not really going to add anything to the painting. Usually I will start out by painting a particular section in a thin layer of paint. And by thin, I don't mean really watery where it's likely to run into other sections. I just mean there's not a huge amount of paint on the brush. So I will paint in the object as realistic as I can get it. I want the colours to be fairly accurate. But once that bit is done and the outline is there, then I will go in with a smaller brush and add any detail that I think is missing. It is surprising how detailed something can look just with a suggestion of colour here and there. On a side note, I do think that tiny paintings can be a good practice thing to do just to get used to not detailing your paintings quite so much. When you're working on a small scale, it is so easy to make the painting look really busy because you've just added in a bit too much information. So you really have to work on restricting yourself and not adding in absolutely everything that you see. And I think that's a really useful skill that can then be transferred into larger paintings because it's showing you what is important, what absolutely has to be in that painting for it to make sense, and what can you realistically ignore where it isn't going to make that much of a difference to the portrait as a whole. Figuring out how much detail to add to the features, such as the eye, is probably one of the trickiest parts of the painting process when you're working on a scale this small. And that is because you want it to look like an eye, you want to put some information in there, but it is so easy to go over the top in these particular sections. So what I did in this instance was I painted a dark area first just to map out the shape. I made a very general brown colour for the eye rather than creating lots of different brown colours that I could actually see in there. I put in the features that were important, so the white of the eye and some of the highlight around the bottom of the eye, and then that was kind of it. Adding too much more than that is when things start to get a little bit busy, and usually when I try and add more detail to a feature that is already pretty small, it gets smaller and smaller still as I get tighter and tighter with the painting, and then when I take a step back, the eye seems to have shrunk because I've been working on it so much. I like to get things to a stage where I feel like it's good enough and it looks fairly realistic, and then I will leave it because you can always come back to it if you need to, and sometimes it's easier to decide whether or not you need more information once you've done the rest of the painting. When you see everything all together, you will get a general sense of whether it looks realistic or if it looks a little bit flat, do you need some more information, and then you can rework sections if you need to. It can be a little bit easier to make those kind of decisions once you see the painting all together as a whole. One other tip that I have for doing this kind of painting is I try and preserve the drawing where I can with an initial line of paint. So you'll have seen me do that with the bottom edge of the mouth there, and in a moment you will see the same thing with the nose. So I will take some paint and put in the outline, so put in the nostrils and draw the outer edges of the nose so I know whereabouts I've got to work up to, and then I can work within those boundaries knowing that I'm not going to ruin my drawing by going over the edges. It's easy to lose your drawing when you're doing a painting like this and to end up with something that looks a little bit different. So where possible, I do try and create little outlines, little reminders of where certain features are, and then I know that that's the boundary that I can work up to, but I don't want to really be going over that with the paint. Another tip that I have for painting tiny pet portraits is to try and work from a limited number of colour mixes. I have quite a lot of paint on my palette, but usually I'll create 1 or 2 main colours and then I will make minor adjustments to those and use that in my painting, and that way it ties everything together. It's easy for a painting to look busy with too much detail, but it can also look busy with too much colour, especially when you're working on a really small scale. It helps to tie things together if there's some harmony in the colours, and I find that it's easier to do that if I work from a limited number of colour mixes and just make minor adjustments as I go along. I also adjust the colour sometimes on the actual painting itself. There are many rules when it comes to painting, and I know that mixing colours on the paper or the canvas is usually one of those things that you're supposed to avoid, but I actually like making adjustments as I go. So if I feel like an area needs to be a little brighter, or it could do with being a little more yellow or red, then I will just mix that into the paint that is already there until I have a colour that I feel better suits the painting as a whole. I feel like I have waffled quite a lot in this video, but hopefully there's some useful points in here as well. we are kind of getting to the end of this painting now, and so when I reach this stage, I will have a look at the painting overall, see what I think to it, and then I will decide to add more detail if I feel like it's necessary. You don't want to get carried away here and undo the work that you've already done, but this is just tidying things up. So fixing some areas, maybe adding in a few bits of whisker detail. It's in these stages as well where I will include the brightest highlights. Usually I'll hold back from putting in the brightest areas until the very end, and then I can choose where I want those highlights to be. It can be good at this stage to take a picture of the painting and compare it to your reference photo to see if there's anything that's a little bit off. There is, in this instance, is not exactly the same, but it looks realistic, it looks like the dog in question, and I am happy to leave it as it is. So I will remove the tape from around the edges, being careful to try not to rip the paper as I do that, and then we'll be done. I hope some of this has been useful. I do find this way of painting is a bit of a challenge to teach because a lot of it is about intuition and just changing colours as you move along and adding extra bits to the painting as you go. And so there is not a very specific blueprint to follow, but hopefully there'll be some useful pointers in there that might help you if you also want to work on a tiny scale. If there is anything in particular that you'd really like to know about painting pet portraits, either at this scale or larger, let me know in the comments. That brings us to the end of this video. So thank you very much for watching. I appreciate you being here. Please consider giving the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, or subscribing to the channel if you want to talk about more tiny paintings. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will see you next time.